Thank you so much, everyone. It's just been an incredible day. And I didn't originally plan to, but perhaps I was inspired by my colleague Anuba and Eleni and a few of us here today to maybe just say a few words on my positionality, because I also, I loved your analogy, Anuba, of feeling decolonization before you kind of even encountered the word. I was born in Istanbul and raised there. My mom is Turkish. My dad is a British Pakistani man of Kashmiri descent. So I kind of have always been the in-between person. So I have a British and a Turkish passport as well, but no English ethnicity to speak of. So I was quite cognizant from a young age of the differences between my multiple ethnicities, the languages spoken at home, and then the artifacts of the nation state, which did not correspond entirely to my ethnicities, given Britain was alien to me until I moved here in 2009, and yet I always had one of its passport as one of my two passports. So, you know, then there was also the added layer of being cognizant that I was born in a post-imperial space, in the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, but also my dad was in Britain only because of the fallout in Kashmir with the partition of India and Pakistan, one of the many families who had to leave everything behind in what is now Indian-administered Kashmir and walk, you know, on foot across the mountains, across the Himalayas, and get to Pakistani-administered Kashmir, purely because of the accident of their Muslimness. So in a way, I think before I even got the vocabulary through university here in the UK to discuss things related to decolonizing and decolonization, I kind of was always already feeling ill at ease in multiple situations in my life, unable to be recruited easily to Turkish nationalism, which is a rampant part of daily life in Turkey. But neither was I particularly convinced by white liberal narratives of, progress being the domain of the West and so forth. So, you know, I guess I had a healthy skepticism that I didn't know how to put into words until I was given the vocabulary to do so through lots of reading, both anti-colonial thinkers as well as radical global northern thinkers as well. I mean, as my book suggests, this is not my work, my primary work. I work on the psychopolitical problem that Ngugi wa Thiong'o once called decolonizing the mind, that Fanon once called inferiority complexes, that Thomas Sankara called reconditioning our people's minds. This question of how our very selves remain to be transformed out of the legacies of colonialism. But I do that through film and literature, believing that cultural production is the way to reconstituting our subjectivities out of colonial beliefs and ideas. And I thought today what I could contribute with was revisiting third cinema, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, and thinking about especially film journals, and dealing with the fact that we have loads of pedagogical methods in our classroom we may use, but in my observation at least, we still kind of have to then release our students out into the world for them to do their original research and complete assessments, and what they often go out to read are still pretty traditional film journals with single-authored articles that are within an established kind of editorial framework. So we still haven't moved away from the necessity of film journals and written film criticism. And how can we think of that in our toolbox as a decolonial tool rather than what it currently is, which is a lot of single-authored articles that may or may not have a decolonial method. We kind of just release them into their own research and hope for the best, So I thought I'd start with words written in 1964 by Onat Kutlar, a socialist Turkish writer and journalist. I begin here because of this really unexpected connection I found. It opened up a lot of questions, but I'll just get right to it. So Kutlar wrote in an article, I asked if we could make a film outside of the thematic and formal confines of Yeşilçam. Yeşilçam is Turkey's Hollywood, the kind of commercial capitalist main cinema studio. And that won't be possible, director Metin Erksan replied. I tried to convince him, pointing to the example of the Indian Satyajit Ray's Apu trilogy, but Metin remained stubborn. It wasn't as successful anyway. I'm sad to say that even our most esteemed filmmakers think the system is fine as it is. So Kutlar went on to take matters into his own hands. Alongside other socialist and communist writers, intellectuals, culture critics, and filmmakers, he set up the Cinematheque Foundation, and that went on to introduce new forms of film circulation and consumption. They had group screenings. They screened international cinemas of the global south. The Turkish intelligentsia are incorrigible Francophiles and Europhiles. So it was a big deal for Kutlar to prioritize teaching Turkish audiences Indian cinemas, Iranian cinemas, Chinese cinemas, and so forth. And then they had very third cinematic post-film Q&As, consciousness-raising sessions, and bursaries for breakaway film clubs. So I hope this may be making apparent two kind of interwoven lines of inquiry. One is that there is a radical tradition that exists in film practice that always has tried to look for alternatives outside of the Hollywood and Western model, but also that radical film practice matters just as other material forms of resistance mattered as well in this time of political foment. Turkey, of course, did not have the context that Latin America had, that Africa and Asia had. It was a post-imperial space. It did not have to grapple with the crippling structural and cultural legacies of colonialism. But it did have other forms of external and internal imperialism to challenge. So cinema was one of the tools that was attempted to be used as a challenge, largely towards a Turkish state that was very closely aligning itself with NATO and American imperialism. So there's a longer version of this work where I also look at the seventh art. We've got a couple of copies circulating, but just today I'll focus on what was a very explicitly third cinematic text, which is Genç cinema, or youth cinema. But also, in keeping with the pedagogical focus of today, I'm really interested in the methods employed by Genç cinema as a film journal. All of us in this room, we've probably set assessments, marked assessments. They are an inevitable part of our education system. And I think one question we haven't yet asked, but I'm sure is related to all the questions we've asked, is despite the wealth of resources, digital and traditional, available for our classroom teaching, film journals and other print materials, I think, do remain important sources for our students, as either they're outright required by a lot of the assessments that we set, right? We have criteria that asks that they engage with film scholarship, for instance, right? Or they're at least encouraged to consult printed material as part of their university level work, right? I'm very open to discussing why that privileging happens, especially when there's great digital tools, great collaboratively created tools. But for practical purposes of today, we're still stuck with directing our students towards printed and written material around film criticism. So I guess discussing this journal, I'm discussing this journal in the light of the question, we may pursue decolonial pedagogies in our learning environments and in the cinematic material we set and discuss together, but how can we then help create conditions where our students kind of, once they go off to undertake their own research, perhaps towards writing an essay, have a growing wealth of sources to refer to that sustain and deepen, hopefully, the decolonial pedagogies that they're experiencing in the classroom, right? How does that transition occur a little bit more seamlessly? And I don't think print and digital film journals will go away anytime soon. And I'm not alone, I'm sure, in thinking the kind of paywalled, often single-authored scholarly essays with the heavy focus on canonicity are particularly accessible or relevant to decolonial pedagogical methodologies. So there is this dissonance. And that's kind of why I want to revisit the one radical Turkish film journal of the so-called long 60s, because not only are their formats both familiar and very different to what we've now come to expect, but they're also avowedly concerned with something I feel is really missing from the discussion around decolonization: political consciousness, right? Whatever happened to that terminology that a lot of anti-colonial filmmakers and thinkers used to avowedly say was the goal of their filmmaking? It's in a way almost something shied away from these days. Inspired by the anecdotes and case studies you shared, Stephen, I remembered one of my own where there was a scholar who had just won a grant to work on a African female filmmaker, and they were very keen to discuss this filmmaker's aesthetics and kept suggesting that her aesthetics kind of excuses the fact that she was a committed communist. And I was kind of like, well, we can still talk about her aesthetics and we can still talk about her politics. Why are we talking about her aesthetics as though they are a balm for this kind of naivety of her political activities, you know? And so I think even if we don't name it, I find somebody who works on 60s and 70s material, there is a kind of unspoken judgment around filmmakers who express as their avowed goal political consciousness raising, rather than goals such as personal expression, aesthetic experimentation, or even representation and the revival of African or Asian forms. If we have a filmmaker who says, my goal is to raise political consciousness, then they're almost treated as though their work is mimetically naive, right? So I think, I do believe this must be a core component of decolonized pedagogy if it is to have any teeth, right? We are trying to reinvent forms and pursue new horizons, but what we're also trying to do is work with a set of students who are possibly, wherever they come from, as Anuba mentioned, immersed in the Euro-American imaginary, right? So we are also trying to change their very consciousness of the world and get them to make connections between themselves and oppression that is occurring around the world, right? So I do think, I think a decolonization that removes consciousness raising from its agenda has been defanged in a way, and defanging decolonization would really help a lot of reactionaries. So I don't want to take too long describing the context, but I do think it's important. Located in the Eastern Mediterranean in both Europe and Asia, Turkey has often slipped through the disciplinary cracks. Though it was capitalist at the time, Turkey was not an advanced capitalist nation. It was never a colony, but an empire that turned into a republic. But it did also have a war of independence, ironically from the British and the French, who tried to cannibalize the remains of the Ottoman Empire in 1923. So there was a war of independence against British and French imperialism, but it was a crumbling empire trying to consolidate what it could of its borders, rather than an anti-colonial struggle. Just to make that clear, I don't position Turkey in a post-colonial way. So Turkey's 60s don't fit the bill of a national liberation struggle, but it was an unprecedented time of radicalization, artistic experimentation, and youthful kind of disaffection. It was also a period marked by military coups, which doesn't say much because we have a coup every 40 years, rising social polarization, anti-communist witch hunts, and political violence. But of course, like these times tend to birth, a lively cultural scene emerged here with magazines, newspapers, literature, music, and cinema. Left-wing radical activity continued unabated throughout the 70s, and that's where the journal I'm discussing today emerges. A decisive and very traumatic military coup in 1980 kind of crippled the Turkish left and put a stop to all of this and forced through neoliberal market reforms, but I won't get around to that. Suffice to say, like, American neoliberalism had a really tough time penetrating Turkey, and in 1980 it finally did it by just massacring students and writers and thinkers and, you know, journalists. But a year prior, actually, to the publication of Solanas and Gettino's seminal 1969 essay, Towards a Third Cinema, a splinter group out of Cinematheque, you'll remember the foundation Kutlar created, emerged, and they declared the following in their manifesto for a new film magazine. We hereby declare that we commit ourselves to the realization and the dissemination of a cinema running parallel to the efforts and consciousness of people. The Youth Cinema Manifesto, this is a film journal, stated amongst other things, one, that culture stems from and lives within societies. The arts therefore cannot be conceived of as separate from the society that produces them. This may not be news to us, of course, but this is, remember, a very grassroots journal that is trying to raise consciousness at a very grassroots level. And two, that a cinema with authentic national consciousness, rings of Fanon there, will by its very qualities open out into international consciousness. So youth cinema, or Genç cinema, believed that Turkey's national moment corresponded to what the Argentine group Cine Liberación referred to as a new historical situation that needed a new cinema of its time. And what's incredible is that the group's praxis and how they derived content from the journal is one of the first differences from other traditional film journals. It wasn't single-authored content necessarily that was about treating films as text or explaining various settings. It was very much a praxis that was about guerrilla documentarianism, creating a living archive of a radical history and then doing the critical pedagogy in the journal. So what does that look like? Well, they were kind of committed to bringing the streets onto the screen, in their words. So they firstly filmed with whatever equipment they could borrow or buy. They recorded via handheld camera demos and marches that are now immortalized in Turkish left history. These are two examples. This is Bloody Sunday, and there was also the Garze tobacco strike. And by 1971, the magazine was gone largely because the Turkish military issued the government an ultimatum, and there was what was called a coup by memorandum. I told you there are loads of coups in this story. So I'm going to get a little bit more into the practical aspects of why their methodologies are worth revisiting. Because it attests to a short-lived but geographically quite wide-ranging political and artistic desire, right? Whilst Genç Cinema members were doing work on the ground that I think we can call guerrilla archiving, the group also had started to attempt to weave cinema into the fabric of everyday life. And I think this falls into two parts: political pedagogy and community voice. I'm so sorry, I'm going to rush a bit now. So firstly, it did have articles, but they were often jargon-free and drawing from real-life examples. For instance, this one is a report on the material conditions of filmmaking in Turkey, and its whole purpose is to get people thinking that the economic structures in which we make film and we try to pull two cents together is not separate from the cultural hegemony of the images we see on screen. When they say that, they mostly refer to Hollywood in this case, right? But also, they often held film screenings, and they also, so these film screenings were at not just universities, but mostly unions and rural settings, urban settings for the public. Again, doing very third cinematic work. It was always Q&A. And what I found very interesting is it also very much welcomed local voices. Anybody could write to the journal and get published if they were discussing the situation of film going in their own hometown and what forces were at work, how much the ticket costs, what they wanted to see, what they weren't seeing. So there's a very interesting kind of way that the journal space is being used for I think, both political pedagogy and community voice that we can very easily emulate, I think, in much of the film journals that we have at hand today. I think it's one of the easy wins in a way, where the hard work that we're doing is all the things that have already been covered, but at the same time, rethinking the material our students will encounter once they go off as independent researchers is part of our work. I'm guessing many of us are on editorial boards and so forth. So how can we reimagine the way we in print discuss film and approach what are the limits of what a journal can do? You know, because you don't expect a journal to be, you know, producing handheld footage or holding educational screenings. So I do think this remains an important tool in our decolonial pedagogy toolbox, but not necessarily in its current form. And you know, the importance of that in the task of consciousness raising, I think, is very nicely summarized by M.S. Césaire. I always go back to a little known essay by him. You know, he's known for a discourse on colonialism, but his essay, The Man of Culture and His Responsibilities, he says, you know, it was the task of the poets, the artists, the writers, the people of culture, we could say filmmakers, by blending in the daily round of sufferings and denials of justice, both memories and hopes, to create those great reserves of strength from which people can draw courage in critical moments, right? And that leap does not always happen organically. The leap between watching a film and using it as a great reserve of strength from which you can draw in critical moments. And I think that bridge is where all of our tools, including a different way of doing film journals, could reside. Thank you. Sorry for the rush at the end.